Every year, The Economist publishes a list of the most livable cities in the world. And every year, people in those cities see that list and say, are you sure? Take Copenhagen, for example. I live here, and before you Danes jump in the comments and tear me apart, I will say that I love it here, but still, if you ask even most Danes whether it's the most livable city in the world, they'll probably pause and then begin to give you a lengthy monologue about the rain, the cost of rent, the 6 months of darkness, the talking points that we all hear. And again, I'm not saying that Copenhagen isn't great. It is, but even the people who live here and have lived here their whole lives don't always see it that way. They don't see it as some utopian paradise, and most of them don't want to oversell the image of the city to the world. And yet Copenhagen almost always lands near the top of this ranking, along with other cities like Vienna and Zurich and Geneva. And all of these cities, they're all great on paper. They're functional, they're safe, they're well organized, but does that actually mean they're good, or dare I say the best place to live? That's the question we're breaking down today, by looking at who this ranking is actually for, how it's put together, and why it completely ignores what makes a city feel like home, or for most people in the world, makes a city livable. Because spoiler alert, this list isn't really about livability at all. Now, we need to begin the conversation by addressing who this ranking is actually for. Now, if you look at how The Economist's most livable city ranking is structured, it becomes pretty clear that it's not designed for regular people deciding where to move, or your cousin who got a job offer abroad and wants to know what life will be like for her there. Our villain here is a familiar one. This list is made for corporations. Specifically made for corporations that relocate their highly paid executives and need a way to justify their salaries and hardship allowances. So if a company is sending somebody from, say, New York City to Zurich, they need to calculate whether that person will need extra compensation for the move. So The Economist provides them with a neat little index: how safe it is, how stable it is there good health care, can you get a decent oat milk cappuccino? Great, Zurich is livable. But this ranking has nothing to do with whether a city is fun, or affordable, or even enjoyable to live in for the long term. It's a corporate comfort index for people who are going to do a 2-year expat contract around the world. It's not really a guide for where you'll be the happiest. That's why the same types of cities dominate the list every year, and places that are well run, that are predictable and easy to navigate, if you have money and an MBA and your name is Brett, always make the top of the list. That's also why affordability isn't really factored in. Now, Brett can afford 2 T's in his name, so he can afford a flat in Zurich, but rent prices, the cost of groceries, general accessibility for people on a normal income, that doesn't really matter. If you're a high-level expat with a relocation package like Brett, you'll be fine. If you're a student, a freelancer, or a digital nomad, or anybody just trying to make it work, well, good luck, babe. Now let's go back to Copenhagen and get into the real tea, and not one of the ones that are in Brett's name. Copenhagen is the perfect example of a city that scores well in this ranking, but has some pretty significant flaws that never seem to make the final calculation. And you guys know me, I try to keep it real, and I ditch that American urge to sugarcoat things. Yes, the infrastructure is amazing, the public transport runs on time, the bike lanes make it easy to get around, and the healthcare system is solid. Yes, the crime rate is low, and yes, if you have a decent job, you'll probably be able to live comfortably. Maybe not in the city center or your favorite neighborhood, but comfortably somewhere in the area. However, what's not factored in is the overall experience of living here as a regular person. For one, the weather can be brutal sometimes, and that's the only part of the weather that's actually predictable. Winters are long, they're dark and rainy, and they last for months on end. The sun sets before 4 p.m., and people who have lived here their whole life can still struggle with that, and those of us who haven't lived here their whole life will definitely find it hard to adjust. Seasonal depression is real. Then there's the housing situation, which can be a nightmare because there just isn't enough of it. Even if you can afford an apartment, finding one that isn't snatched up quickly is challenging. And that goes for people that are from here and people that move here. And socially, Denmark is famous for being one of the hardest places to break in as a newcomer. Danes are friendly, but they're not necessarily friend-making. It can take years to build a social circle, and in that meantime, you can get kind of bummed out, wondering if you'll ever be invited to anything that isn't an actual work event. So sure, Copenhagen is livable for the right person, in the right situation, for the right amount of time, and with the right salary and winter jacket. But for others, it can be cold, isolating, and wildly expensive. And that's the problem with this ranking. It assumes livability is something that you can predict with data and measure in numbers, when in reality, it's completely dependent on who you are and what you need from a city. It's about people and not about numbers. So let's talk about what actually goes into this ranking. The Economist scores cities based on 5 different categories: stability, healthcare, culture and environment, education, and infrastructure. Which sounds reasonable enough, but when you look at what's actually being measured in each of these categories, you start to see the cracks in the sidewalk. So first, let's look at stability. Now, this category covers things like crime rates, political stability, and whether or not there are riots in the streets. And obviously, these things matter, but stability doesn't automatically mean that a city is great to live in. A place can be perfectly stable and still be dull, soulless, or completely unaffordable. I come from Philadelphia, and we riot every time our team wins a playoff game, and also when we lose. So that's kind of a bad example, but it's also kind of my point. The city is anything but boring. Then there's healthcare. But the way that this ranking measures healthcare is through availability and quality, which includes private healthcare. So that means that a city can score high even if its public healthcare system is mediocre or being dismantled by Elon Musk. Because again, this ranking is made for expats with private insurance, not for regular folks like you and me. Culture and environment is where things kind of get weird because this category factors in climate. And I know that is part of the environment, but it also means that cities with mild weather like Vancouver and Vienna have a baked-in advantage, even though weather is something that cities can't really control, because trust me, if we could here in Copenhagen, we would. But with cold and windy winters and rainy summers, we get docked points for simply existing in Scandinavia. Education is mostly based on the availability of good schools, but specifically international schools, which again is another sign that this ranking isn't about the average resident's experience, it's about expats. And infrastructure, it measures things like road quality, housing standards, and public transportation. But again, it doesn't take into account whether people can actually afford those things. So what you end up with is a ranking that tells you whether a city is well functioning, but not whether it's a good place to actually build a life for more than a 2-year expatriation contract. Now, before you go and call me woke or some other undefined buzzword, let's talk about where the biases in this survey and ranking is actually leading us, if you can't figure it out already. The Economist ranking very clearly skews towards Western Europe, Canada, and Australia. The top cities are almost always in places like Vienna, Zurich, Copenhagen, and Melbourne. These cities are wonderful. They're safe, they're quiet, they're relatively small, and life there is pretty predictable. Meanwhile, cities that are vibrant, exciting, and full of life, but a little bit bigger, like Tokyo or Mexico City, even Bangkok, are often ranked lower because they're considered too chaotic. But chaos is not the opposite of livability. A city can be loud and messy and still offer a better quality of life than a place that's perfectly organized but isolating and expensive. So when people think about the best cities to live in, they don't only think about safety and stability, they think about things like culture, energy, social connections, and whether they can actually afford to have a good life there. But those things don't fit neatly into the Economist scoring system, so they get ignored for the stuff that matters most to Brett. So what does livability actually mean? Because if you ask the Economist, it means safety, stability, and good infrastructure. But if you ask the non-Brett population of the world, it often means affordability, community, and happiness. If a city doesn't have those things, does it really matter if the trains run on time? Plus, I need an excuse for being late. But at the end of the day, this ranking isn't telling you where you'll be the happiest, which to me and most people is the most important. What it does is tell corporations where their employees will struggle the least. And that's why it's always the same cities at the top. Places that work well on paper, but in real life might not be the dream destinations for everyone. So if you're considering moving to one of these top-ranked cities, just take it with a grain of salt, because a city can be livable on paper and still a terrible place to actually live. Because we aren't all Brett, and even he is a person and not just a data point or an algorithm or a spreadsheet. He's got dreams and emotional needs and feelings, which maybe I hurt. So Brett, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. You were just an example of a corporate zombie, but I know you matter and you may want to know what it's actually going to cost you if you do end up living in Copenhagen. And for you, Brett, let me make it up to you by giving you this video about the cost of living in Copenhagen. And actually, anybody can watch it and see what it's like to live and budget yourself in Copenhagen. The video was made about a year and a half ago, so do some quick inflation adjustments as you watch it. But thanks for watching this video, guys, and remember to find happiness and be glad wherever you're living. Hi, hi.